Good evening, everybody. My name is Pastor Darren Wiebe. I'm pastor here at Lakeview Lutheran Church, and we're pleased you're here tonight. Especially like to welcome any guests with us this evening. Two quick announcements. Our speaker this evening is Emeritus Professor Charles Cohen from UW Madison here, and I'm really excited and interested in his presentation tonight. We're very grateful to have you. 100% of tonight's offering goes to what we do with all our speakers is we ask them, where would you like the offering to go? And so tonight's offering, 100% will go to Wisconsin Faith Voices for Justice, which Professor Cohen is active. So there's an offering plate on the way out if you'd like to give to that organization. Let us begin. Hear my prayer, O Lord.
Listen to my cry.
Keep me as the apple of your eye.
Hide me in the shadow of your wings.
In righteousness I shall see you.
When I await your presence with joy.
Let us pray. Eternal God, the hours both of day and night are yours, and to you the darkness is no threat. Be present, we pray, with those who labor in these hours of night, especially those who watch and work on behalf of others. Grant them diligence in their watching, faithfulness in their service, courage in danger, and competence in emergencies. Help them to meet the needs of others with confidence and compassion. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. All right, I turn it over to Professor Cohen.
Thank you, Pastor. Thank you, Pastor. Let's do it this way. If you can hear me, raise your hand. Okay, I don't see anyone whose hand is not raised, so that works. Thank you for inviting me. I've never, I almost said preached from a Lutheran pulpit before, and I'm honored to have been called during this time of Lent. I hope I won't prove to be something that will be easy for you to give up. So, let's begin. I want to talk tonight about Jews and Muslims in Christian America. My parents always told me there are two things that I should never discuss in polite company: religion and politics. But we're no longer a polite society, I fear. So I'm going to do both because they mingle in our national life. What I want to do to begin is to set out what I see as some of the basic conditions of American religious political culture, and then talk a little bit about Jews and Muslims and different characteristics, and then how differences are adjudicated within our society, and finally draw some conclusions. The basic features of American religious culture today, as I see it, are these, and there are 4 points. One is that the deep structure has to do with the arrangements of what I like to call the American Revolutionary Settlement of Religion. That is to say, the Constitution, the laws coming out of the Revolutionary period, the ways in which Americans developed their at least basic understanding of the relationship between religion and the state. One of those differences is in the First Amendment, that the federal government will apply no religious tests. There are other rights in the First Amendment, free, right of the people to assemble and petition, etc., free speech, but we can forget about those. They're not that important. A second thing is that Americans have tended, and I'll be coming back to this, to value religious freedom. A second thing is that the United States has what I find to be a fascinating civic religious culture. There are several aspects to this. One is that we are friendly as a nation to religion. And this graph, let me see. Oh, there we are. So the higher you go, the x-axis is percentage of adults who say they pray daily, and the y-axis is per capita domestic product per capita. So in some places, and this is somewhat, the curve is somewhat intuitively predictable. As wealth increases, the amount of people who at least self-report as praying decreases. And so you get sort of, Western Central Europe here, places from the old Soviet bloc here, other countries here, and there's the outlier. And yes, we're very much aware of the increasing number of nuns, of people who claim they're not affiliated with any kind of denomination in particular. Still, there's something to this curve, I think. A second thing is that there's an element of nationalism in various ways of saying that the United States is a Christian nation. Now, the weak form of that claim is simply there are more Christians or people who profess to be Christians than there are people who profess to be anything else. But that doesn't take us very far. More interesting are some of the stronger claims that are sometimes made by Christian nationalists. That God, for example, has a special relationship with, or that the United States has a special relationship with God. This goes back to the covenant, ultimately goes back to the covenant with the original covenant that God has with Israel. It gets imported here that notion gets imported by the Puritans in the 17th century. Another claim would be that it was the intent of the framers of the Constitution to create a Christian state, that Christianity informs our institutions, that they are Christian institutions as opposed to, say, coming out of the English parliamentary system or systems of democracy going back to ancient Greece and Rome, or that the United States is an exceptional nation. God has dedicated the United States to do something special. I'll just claim, and if you want to pursue this in the Q&A, we can. I think there's little evidence for that in those claims at the federal level in the revolutionary generation. But at the state level, things, at least in the 18th, early 19th century, were a little different. So the South Carolina Constitution of 1778, for instance, says the Christian Protestant religion, and that encompasses, there's an assumption being made implicitly there, shall be deemed and is hereby constituted and declared to be the established religion of this state. Wait, doesn't the First Amendment prohibit that? Not in the early 19th century. It has to take Supreme Court interpretations later on to apply the Bill of Rights to the states. Originally, states could have establishment. And Massachusetts had an establishment until 1833. A third point I would say is that for many, maybe most Americans, when they think about religion, the most important matter is individual conscience. So from a theological standpoint, kind of a generalized Protestant sense of an individual standing before God or before authority. And finally, the most important component that many Americans would probably say is the most important component of their religion is belief. That's how we define religion. Now, these conditions can lead to certain tensions. Our institutions, especially now, are geared on a premise that citizenship does not depend on religious affiliation. There's a core, that should be a core value. Let me see. That's, that religious freedom is a core value. Remember when there were 3-cent stamps? 1957. The Flushing Remonstrance goes back to 1657 when the Director General of New Amsterdam, since my native city was at that point a Dutch colony, said we're not going to have Quakers here. And English town, the English town of Flushing, Vlissingen at that point, says, well, we don't agree. And so they remonstrated, which was a very popular activity in the mid-17th century. But they said, we're going to allow our Quakers to practice. We also tend not to define citizenship in terms of religious grounds. The Constitution of the great state of Wisconsin, after all, says no person, wrong button, no person shall be rendered incompetent to give evidence in any court of law or equity in consequences of his opinions on the subject of religion. As far as I know, that provision is still in force in our great state. The United States is not a Christian nation in any legal sense, but it might be in other senses. What happens if religious beliefs and the practices of minority collide with constructions that the United States is a Christian state? And recently, we've seen some very strong assertions of what Christian nationalism could be. What people call Christian, or sometimes white Christian nationalism, in a recent definition, is a cultural framework, a collection of myths, traditions, symbols, narratives, and value systems that idealizes and advocates a fusion of Christianity with American civic life. The Christianity and I'll just say, recently, as many of you, perhaps all of you are aware, your fellows, I hope they're still fellows, in the Missouri Synod have declared Christian nationalism to be a heresy. So the Christianity of Christian nationalism may be suspect, but it includes assumptions of nativism, white supremacy, patriarchy, and heteronormativity, along with divine sanction for authoritarian control and militarism. And one emblem of that is that picture, which I think is worth 1,000 words. The underlying sentiment of this is that the United States belongs to Christians, and that people from other traditions are here on Christian sufferance. We're also seeing a redefinition of religious freedom. Traditionally, it has tended to mean a negative sense. That is, that the state may not interfere in the worship and practice of any person's religion. But now it's coming to be defined more often by courts in a positive way, that the state has a duty to protect behavior, and that behavior that issues from sincerely held religious beliefs, which can be anything as long as you can demonstrate that they are sincerely held. And it's hard to demonstrate that they're not. So, what I want to do is explore the use of Jews and Muslims to probe into these issues a little more. I want to suggest that arguments over different practices are generally resolved by formal and informal mechanisms. And I also want to suggest this, that the most acute conflicts don't involve religious practices per se, but rather political doubts. That is, what minority religious groups may often seem to be doing is to be transgressing a sense that the United States is a Christian nation. Another way of putting that is, can religious minorities really, when push comes to shove, be citizens? So what I want to do is give some very generalized, overgeneralized thumbnail sketches of Christianity or Christian, Jewish, Muslim beliefs and actions regarding 4 categories: space, time, space, food, and the state. And then we'll go from there. For Christianity, there is no single central sacred space. There are certainly pilgrimage sites. For Catholics, Rome is important, though as much as an administrative center, I suspect, than as anything else. Not, as we'll come to see, in the way that sacred space is defined or identified in Judaism and Christianity. But American Christians, to some degree, and to a large degree, for many of them, have come to claim the United States as a symbol. The United States is God's land. And so, in that sense, the land itself becomes sacralized. America, America, God shed his grace on thee. Regarding time, Christian churches, some more than others, observe a religious calendar beginning with Advent, and here we are now in Lent. The first half of the year tending to focus on Christ the Redeemer. The second half of the year, most of which is ordinary time, Christians are urged to meditate on Christ's redemption to themselves. There are weekly cycles, of course, ending with the Sabbath on Sunday. And the Latin calendar that is basically the global calendar for all intents and purposes, does encode the Christian sacred year. Regarding food, Christians observe no particular dietary regimen, for which I bless them. I used to run an institute for the study of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and we would have members from all of those groups come together often for conferences. And planning the menu, as you may well imagine, could be difficult. But I thank Christians because they'll eat anything. There's no general prohibition for alcohol, certainly not for Lutherans. Baptists we'll put over there somewhere. And wine has sacramental uses. There, as for the state, the great creeds of Christianity say nothing about the state. But the idea, particularly in Western Christianity, developed in late antiquity, in the Roman Empire and early modern times, that there should be one church in one state. That is, if religion were not highly allied with the state, and one particular religion were not highly allied with the state, then the state would fall apart. The emblem of that, for me, is Charles. This is the coronation picture of Charles II in England, who was the last Charles until very, very recently. And I chose it, ermine robes, really nice. But I chose it also because Charles is holding two symbols: the orb for his governorship of the church, and the scepter symbolizing his governorship or his kingship over the state. And that idea held sway in Western European countries for well over a millennium. Western Christian lands now, along with most of the world, we have no real empires anymore. Political polities are divided into modern liberal states, and the modern state tends to ask, the nation state asks that foremost loyalty be given to the state, not necessarily to one's church. For Judaism, there is a very definite sacred space. And it looks, well, it used to look like that. This is a model, a presumed model, or the model is real. It's a presumed good copy of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. And this area is the Holy of Holies, which could be entered only by the high priest and only once a year at Yom Kippur, because it was thought to be the place where God dwells on earth. So that's the space. Many Jews will still not go on to the Temple Mount because it's not entirely clear where that space was, and you wouldn't want to walk through it because that's God's space. Now, that ground is contested in ways that I'm not going to go into now, but Judaism has a laser focus on that space. Regarding time, and this is a pretty confusing graphic, the Jewish festival calendar is sort of overlays of different kinds of ceremonies. The beginning of the festival year, beginning with Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and that happens in the fall. There are the pilgrimage festivals that commemorate and actually go back to temple times. These were the big 3 harvest festivals, Passover being the first of them. Regarding food, as I'm sure you're well aware, observant Jews follow an extensive repertory of dietary laws, kashrut. There is no prohibition against alcohol per se. A typical, well, not a typical, any Sabbath table would have the Shabbat candles, the challah, the braided bread, and a glass of wine. Wine has sacramental uses, but the strictures for kashrut are very long, very complicated. Suffice it to say that Christians may have cheeseburgers, but observant Jews may not, because you do not mix milk and meat. Judaism has not really, to my knowledge, elaborated a theory of the state, and one good reason for that might be that for the better part, almost 2 millennia, Jews did not hold state power, and so did not have to theorize about it. For most of the people of Israel's existence, Israel has always been, or almost always been, a subject population. Jews have tried to accommodate themselves to the prevailing political system, whatever that might be. Now to Islam. For Islam, there is the most sacred space is this. The mosque in Mecca, the Al-Masjid Al-Haram that surrounds the sacred stone, the Kaaba, which is said to have been built by Abraham and his older son Ismail, as the Quran tells us. The Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, which Muslims are enjoined to complete at least one time in their life if they are at all able. The Hajj is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. Medina, where the Prophet is buried next to an open tomb that is waiting for the return of Jesus, is in Medina, and that is the second holiest spot for Muslims. And Jerusalem, the very spot I showed you a few minutes ago, is the third. Regarding time, there is a sacred calendar. There are two main observances in Islam. Ramadan, which we're coming up to, I'll be showing that in a few minutes. Ramadan is a month, and it is a time during which Muslims fast. I don't want to make too many parallels to Lent. These are dawn to dusk fasts for an entire month where you're not supposed to have anything. So it's a very, very rigorous regimen. It ends with the ceremony or the feast of Eid al-Fitr, the celebration of the feast. The second major holiday, and this is an 18th century Indian observance, is Eid al-Adha, the feast of the sacrifice that ends the Hajj, not only for Hajis, not only for the pilgrims themselves, but really for all Muslims around the world. And it commemorates the sacrifice of Ibrahim's son Ismail in the Quran's telling of the tale, or I should say attempted sacrifice. Though in the Quran it happens in a dream. There are other cycles of time as well, a daily cycle in which Muslims pray 5 times a day. Friday is an especially important day where Muslims go to the mosque during midday usually for a special set of prayers, but it does not have the work prohibition for Muslims that it does for observant Jews. Observant Jews are not supposed to do any work on Shabbat, and what work means is something that rabbis argue about all the time, as if they had nothing else to argue about. The Islamic calendar, though, is lunar, and so it moves against the solar calendar. So as you can see, there's a regression, and here's Ramadan. So 3 years ago, it began on April 24th. This year, it's beginning next week. And it takes about 33 years for this cycle to move in one complete cycle over against a solar calendar. Muslims have dietary laws, laws of halal. They're not quite as complicated as kosher laws. My rule of thumb, and it seemed to work pretty well, was that Muslims coming to one of the Institute's events would be happy to eat kosher food, but not the reverse. Halal food that is good to eat according to Islamic ritual would not satisfy most Jews who observe kosher. So Muslims may have cheeseburgers, but no beer, obviously. And finally, Islamic thinking about the state has been structured by Islam's historic association with the state, at least since the time of Muhammad. Throughout most of history, Islam has often spread in conjunction with state power, but I'm not saying that Islam spread with state power or by the sword, rather that it spread in conjunction with the spread of Islamic governance. And here I want to make a brief forays into two statements that have become two concepts that have become flashpoints in American political discourse. The first is the caliphate. The caliphate is an Islamic form of government in which the caliph is a representative, or ideally is a representative of political unity and the leader of the Muslim world. It comes about because Muhammad was not only a prophet, but he was also a political leader and a judge, which is why the people of Medina wanted him in the first place, to adjudicate their conflicts. No one can replace Muhammad the prophet, but someone has to replace, or was thought to have to replace, Muhammad as a political leader. Hence, there is this notion. Now, the basic split between Sunni and Shia, which I'm not going to go into here, but it is basically, first of all, a political split. It is an argument over who should have been Muhammad's successor. It becomes theological and cultural and all sorts of other things. But initially, it's over who should have taken over the Ummah, the Islamic community. What was supposed to be a unifying force became anything but, as we scroll through Islamic history. Often there were several people claiming to be the caliph at the same time. Finally, the caliphate was abolished by Kemal Ataturk, the reformer of Turkey, and just so you have an image before you, this is the last caliph, Abdul-Majid II, who, at least in this photograph, seems pretty harmless enough. How important it is to reestablish the caliphate is very controversial among contemporary Muslims. On one extreme, you would have the Islamic State and people saying there must be a caliphate, and of course, it's their caliphate. On the other hand, even recently, last month, a civic religious movement in Indonesia, whose name translates to the revival of the ulama, or the revival of the religious scholars, has come out, and we're talking now about 50 million people, maybe 90 million people. This is the largest civil movement within the Islamic world, and they have come out against the caliphate. Islam does not need a caliphate. A second term is Sharia. The thing is that Sharia can mean a number of different things, and sometimes people aren't quite aware in which sense they're using it, and that includes Muslims too. At one point, Sharia is simply ideal law, that is, God's law to which we may aspire, but which a perfectly just law. But we're probably not going to get it. So a second definition has to do with law as implemented, and law as implemented in statute, in judgments, and so on, is fiqh, which we might translate as jurisprudence. Another body of law has to do with administrative law. It's not religious law. So sometimes these things are included when people talk about Sharia, but we might want to break them out. A third meaning of Sharia is the one that really terrifies many Americans, and that is that it is state-sponsored religious law. That's really a pretty recent, as in post-colonial understanding. Yes, it exists. Iran would be a very good example of that. But what I'm trying to suggest is that Sharia does not inevitably mean state-sponsored religious law. In classic Muslim societies, it did not. And finally, there's a very generalized understanding of Sharia as indicating any law that promotes justice. So I've had a Muslim say to me, well, we don't need Sharia and we don't need to implement Sharia in America. We already have it. It's called the Constitution. So it's good to keep those different nuances in mind when that word pops up. Okay, what happens then when Jews and Muslims enter the United States? What I want to suggest now is that the most abrasive conflicts are not over belief or doctrine. Those might agitate some people, but that's not really the crux of the issues. Rather, I think the real issues have to do with perceived religious definitions of America and the perceived implications of the existence of different groups for the American polity. So let's see how these areas that I've just sketched out might operate a little bit. Disagreements about sacred space are, I think, fairly rare, perhaps because, as I suggested before, Christians don't have a single sacred space. Jews and Muslim sacred spaces are overseas. But symbolically, conflicts over sacred space may break out, particularly if we accept the strong claims that the United States is a Christian nation in one or another form of what those beliefs are. And the issue becomes, really can be activated if minority religious groups claim to enter into the national covenant, which some Christians might claim for themselves alone. This plays out in arguments over the display of religious symbols in public spaces, though that's a multifaceted kind of thing. Recently, the Supreme Court has decided that a monument, I want to say it's in Maryland, but I could be completely wrong about that, a First World War monument that displays a huge cross is not considered religious because it's really commemorating the people who fell in World War I, and so is more a civic monument and should not be construed as a religious monument. We're always having one or another tiffs over these kinds of things when Christmas comes. Can we put, is a Christmas tree a sacred symbol? At UW one time, there were someone was offended by a chrysanthemum, not a chrysanthemum, what am I say? Poinsettia, thank you. Euphorbia, my favorite plant family. Right, so those are the kinds of things that may get argued about. And then there are questions about houses of worship. And we remember what happened when there was an effort to build, it was supposed to be an Islamic cultural center with a mosque, but not just a mosque. Next, in downtown Manhattan, near the site of 9/11. There was a national uproar because that touched a nerve. What does it mean to be an American? This is, some people claim, is Muslim triumphalism. How dare they put a swimming pool near ground zero? And this slide shows, to mind, some of the ambiguities. Remember 9/11, so that person is saying, no, we don't want that. Support freedom of religion might be construed as suggesting, well, we Americans welcome freedom of religion. Why can't they build it? Regarding time, issues of time may generate conflict, but I think they've generally been small. The U.S. calendar encodes the Christian ceremonial calendar. The holidays that we get off without thinking about it, Christmas, for example, in many places, at least in the afternoon, Good Friday, and so, are Christian. There's no general observance of the Eids, for example, or of Rosh Hashanah. Conflicts over time can present themselves in personal ways. For Jews, it's the question of, well, I should be in synagogue today, I'm not supposed to work today, can I get time off from my boss so that I can work? I don't know, maybe after the pandemic that's not as much of an issue, but I'm not sure. Some questions can be knotty. And a roof is a ceremonial space that is created to allow observant Jews to carry items that would ordinarily be prohibited outside of their homes to be displayed in wider spaces. So, in small communities, that's maybe not an issue. But let's say someone decides that Northport Drive is now part of my bedroom, and I'm going to prohibit you from driving on it during the Sabbath. So you could see where that would be a problem. But again, that hasn't been much of an issue. I bring it up more for its possibilities. For Muslims, I think their observances fit into the calendar more easily. Ramadan is a tough road to hoe. It was brought to national attention in the mid-90s when the Houston Rockets were going for their championships in the NBA, and Hakeem Olajuwon, their star center, was observing Ramadan. And the issue was not whether he would be allowed to play. It was whether he could play after having fasted the entire day. And as it turns out, he could. And quite well, thank you very much. There's potential for prayer. Muslims pray 5 times a day. To find space to do that is sometimes vexing. I was involved in efforts to create spaces, or at least one space on the UW campus that would be open to any religion, but a place where Muslims might be able to take a quick break, because some of them said, well, we've been praying in bathrooms, and that's really verboten. That may lead to the conflict of, hey, I got to get to LaGuardia, and you're praying. Get in a cab. But again, I don't think these issues have risen to any great extent. Issues of food are primarily adjudicated by the private sector. Christians and non-adherents run the vast number of major markets and restaurants. Jews and Muslims are left to fend for themselves, which they have tended to do. Now we come to the state. In the state's formal operations, the majority of Americans, whatever their religious affiliation, see the United States government as a civil body. Only a small minority, at least as of now, is calling for Christian laws. And there have been calls throughout our history from time to time for an amendment to the Constitution, for example, declaring the United States to be a Christian nation. But if at formal levels our religious culture does not often or always intrude, informally there's a lot of mixing. So the Constitution says that you may impose no religious test on office. Can we as voters impose a religious test for office? You betcha. And I'm sure that we do it all the time, one way or another. It's one of the calculations that probably many of us make. Certainly, John F. Kennedy knew that in 1960 when he was being grilled by Protestant pastors about whether a Catholic, of all things, could be president, or could put his loyalty to the country over his ostensible loyalty, as they worried about it, to the papacy. How much we ask of our public figures to be religious has varied from time to time throughout our history. This may be, in its new version, a little too crowded, but one can see a rhetoric on both sides of the aisle. As Ronald Reagan said, to think that anyone could carry out the awesome responsibilities of this office without asking for God's help through prayer strikes me as absurd. To Obama's, I am a Christian and I pray every night. The last couple of cycles, that temperature, it seems to me, has gone down a little bit. Candidates make obligatory statements, but certainly the temperature on a whole lot of other issues has been ratcheted up to a sun-like intensity. And Jews and Muslims have begun to hold political office. But there's tremendous potential for conflict, particularly at local levels in fields such as family law, in schools. Should religion be in the schools? If so, how should it be? Whose religion should it be? This takes us back in some ways to conflicts that were frequent, usually between Protestants and Catholics in the 19th century. And these concerns also bubble up in the raft of laws that was passed by state legislatures outlawing Sharia, although again, what I think those laws were targeting was Sharia understood as state-imposed religious law, which, as I've also said, many Muslims themselves don't want. So let me wrap this up, and it's about time. I've been saying that there have been tensions, that our institutions are civil, we don't impose religious tests on candidates, at least formally, we value, as Americans in general, religious liberty, at least in its negative sense of the state should not interfere with religious practice and worship. We also have a robust religious civil culture with claims interspersed or interwoven with claims that the United States is a Christian nation, claims which are becoming more and more strident in the past decade. So where do Jews and Muslims fit into all of that? Well, Jews have been present in what was then Anglo-America since the 17th century. Anti-Semitism historically has not been as virulent as it has been in many other periods of Jewish history. It has tended to be social rather than political, although as this graph from the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, suggests, the number of incidents is rising. And I suspect 2022 is even higher, but I could not find figures for that year yet. Why has, at least historically, has anti-Semitism taken that course? Jews were a small demographic presence. They fit into the economy. And their religious practice, particularly in the 19th century when many of the first Jewish migrants in that time period were Reform Jews who downplayed aspects of religious law, some of which that might have been most irritating or most put them most in the line of fire against others. From George Washington on, many American politicians have seen Jews as not being a threat to the state, nor to the Christian identity of the United States. But recently, Christian nationalism, white supremacy, has begun to revive an old stereotype that Jews control everything. Now, I actually Googled Jews control America, and I came up with, the first thing that came up was the Anti-Defamation League. So I'm not quite sure what that's supposed to indicate. But the theory is that Jews control money, they exercise power, they are orchestrating the Great Replacement theory. It's not so much that Jews are going to repopulate the United States, but they're the brains behind all those black and brown people coming. Muslims also have had a long presence in Anglo-American and the United States. This is Yarrow Mahmood, painted by Charles Wilson Peale, one of the great portrait painters and really Renaissance men of the early Republic. He had been brought in the 18th century. He was supposedly about 100 years old when Peale painted him in the early 19th century. Tens of thousands of slaves brought in the 18th century in the Atlantic slave trade were Muslims. We can't know how many. And much of their practice disappeared. For much of the 20th century, as Muslims began to migrate again to the United States, Islam excited very little attention from the populace one way or another. And Muslims began the sort of slow climb up the social ladder that every ethnic group has trudged along in one way or another in our history. But 9/11 changed all of that. It magnified their differences, and I would suggest that the differences have very little to do with the 5 pillars of Islam, or what Muslims believe, or how they practice. Rather, the issue is their perceived incongruity with American democracy. And this cartoon echoes the infamous words of HUAC, the anti-communist investigating committee of the 1950s. Are you now, or have you ever been, a member of what had been the Communist Party is now the neighborhood mosque, that cell of terrorists just down the street? This is conjoined with a sense that Islam, or Islamic civilization, is alien, that Muslims, capital M, all Muslims, want to impose Sharia. Again, which Sharia are we talking about? As a consequence, I think Muslims have had to explain their customs and identity in ways that Jews have not. One final point. The debate over Jews has focused on their alleged attributes, not on the character of Judaism. White supremacists aren't saying, well, that Jewish monotheism is incorrect, or what are those people doing with all those dietary laws? The issue is Jewish character, its alleged connivingness, its mastery behind the scenes. It's not so much what you see Jews doing, it's what you don't see them doing. The debate over Muslims, though, I think has had more to do with the character of Islam, with the identity that Islam is a warlike religion that must generate terrorists because it's been doing that since 632, if they even know what that date means. In both cases, I want to leave you with this thought. This fear and hatred targets not religious practice, but the perceived power that these groups might exercise. Thank you. I think I've managed to fit this in a little bit, and so there's time for questions, and I've made myself mobile. So, yes?
So, do you find any great irony between, like, the fundamental Christian adherence and love for Israel as the coming of the apocalypse versus its, the other given to the fall that
Yeah, I have some pretty strong feelings about that. There is, I mean, from my perspective, there's a certain kind of Christian belief that sees prophecy being fulfilled and the end times coming. And part of the end times is that Jews have to return to Israel. The third temple has to be built, and there are analogs on the Jewish side. I mean, there are some ultra-Orthodox who really want to build the third temple, which is, again, why that area gets to be so contested. From my admittedly partisan standpoint, love of Israel is not necessarily a defense against anti-Semitism. I think that for apocalypticists, what's going on in Israel is ultimately of the fulfillment of a Christian theological vision in which Jews have, as they read Scripture, an inscribed place. But that doesn't mean you have to like them. But, I mean, stereotypes and dysfunctions, I'll dare to make a sociological generalization that I have no right to make, but I'm not a sociologist, so that stereotypes often put together polar opposites. Jews are conniving, but Jews in Israel are carrying out the Lord's work. And how does those things fit together, sir? Well, they do. If logic could unlock it, it would have done so long ago, but it doesn't. Yes?
Given the commonalities among these religions, I'm interested to find out how Christianity lost its dietary, when and how Christianity lost its dietary laws.
You can thank Paul. I mean, go to Acts, go to which is it? I mean, Galatians is an argument. Romans, there's an argument about. Paul is trying to put together what I'll import from Martin Luther King, a blessed community, and his blessed community is of Jews and Gentiles, and this gets into a lot of discussion on recent scholarship of Paul, but the view I am most persuaded by suggests that Paul isn't asking Jews to change their beliefs. He's asking, and regarding such things as meals and so on. But Gentiles don't observe those things. And Paul, it's an argument, if you will, between Paul and James. Because James comes across to me as a Torah, what the scholarship calls Torah observant Jews. And who want Gentiles to, in essence, do you have to become Jewish in order to become what will come to be called Christian? Paul didn't know the term Christian. I'm pretty convinced of that. So, and Paul's view eventually wins out, that it's the Gentiles, the important thing is that they have faith and come into the community in Christ, not that they follow Jewish ceremonial law. Now, in Paul's time, there's a push there. That can be adjudicated. In the not so long run after that, the demography, the people who become Christians, are overwhelmingly Gentiles. I mean, there are a few Jewish Christians, and there are sects that go by various names. But to my way of reading it, that issue goes back to Paul. Yes.
Well, I will be in Alabama in a week, so I have a relative there. And while it may be the law, the Constitution of Christianity is not the religion, they still say a prayer before the second council meeting.
Well,
And it's observed, and in their mind, it's a Christian Christian thing.
Well, and I think what you're opening up is a key into the window of American, what I see as American political, religious political culture. Yes, I'm sure that many people in Alabama think that the United States is a Christian nation. Again, what that means along a spectrum of belief may vary from individual to individual. I've tried to differentiate between weaker claims and then some stronger claims and then some really strong claims. But you also mentioned prayers before city council meetings, and that's one of those areas that the hope that I still cling to is that as long as we talk about these things, we'll be okay. It's when we stop talking about them that we're going to be in real trouble. Congress has had chaplains since the first Congress met in 1789, and actually, I believe, the Continental Congress before that. Now, is this proof that the United States is that religion is a part of government? Well, we can argue about that. And now we've seen an effort over the past number of years to invite non-Christians. So prayer is, Congress still opens with prayer. And maybe that's okay. These infiltrations take place all the time, and people talk about them, and sometimes they get very exercised about them. So, most recently on the football field, football, which has rapidly taken over the church's place on Sunday. Can a high school coach, if a high school coach leads his team in prayer, and as a matter of fact, it's Christian prayer, is that okay? Now, some people get offended about that. Some people feel left out. Other people affirm, well, it's a private prayer, etc. So the borders, I like to say that the quote separation of church and state, which is not a phrase, by the way, that appears in the Constitution, has never been as great as opponents of that, as say the Freedom from Foundation religion would like to think. But it's never been quite as close as those who want to argue that God spoke and the United States came into being without the revolution. It's much murkier than that. Yes?
What has replaced the Caliph in Islam?
Nothing. And so the Caliph, and I think my pronunciation of that varies from minute to minute. Caliph. Again, as I said, it's a position that derives from the question of who is to be Muhammad's successor, in keeping and governing the Ummah, the Islamic community. And so you start to get these dynasties and sometimes these things are decided on the battlefield. And then there are times, the notion was that there would be a unitary figure, who would unite all of Islam. Well, the Arab Empire that stretches by 100 years after Muhammad's death is larger than the Roman Empire at its apex. It's huge, and it starts breaking up as these kinds of huge polities do. And so you have, at certain times, someone declaring a caliphate in Spain, and someone declaring a caliphate in Egypt, and someone declaring a caliphate in Mesopotamia. And there are divisions. Then when the Ottoman Empire becomes ascendant, the Ottomans claim They call themselves sultans, but they claim the caliphate for themselves, and they hold it, and because they are for a long time a major power, they get to hold it, and then they're on the wrong side of in World War I, and there's a revolution, and Kemal Ataturk wants to secularize Turkey and modernize it and bring it into the present, and he abolishes it, and that's it. Now, what gives the Islamic State or other radical Islamists the right to declare themselves? Well, they do, as far as I can see. And as I've suggested, there's a lot of discussion among Muslims about whether the caliphate is necessary. A quick sort of historical intercession is that for a long time, many Muslim empires and political bodies have a great deal of power. With the rise of Europe and European colonialism, that breaks down. And so, in a sense, no one is in a position, really, in the Islamic world to make a caliphate work. Then, as colonialism ebbs in the mid-20th century, what replaces it in many Islamic countries is a nation state, and the question is, how are we going to be Islamic in our nation states? And there's a whole range of attitudes and ways in which those things get worked out, often in conjunction with former European powers or in an effort to emulate former European powers. And so you in many places you get strong men, and authoritarianism has popped up, and that's been the breeding ground for what Sharia in its third sense, as I've defined it, that is, state-sponsored religious law, because regimes want to use, and this goes back to the first caliphates, they want to use Islam as a way of authenticating their rule. The difference being that in classic Islamic civilizations in the medieval period, the civil ruler had power, but the religious scholars have power over religious law. They're actually a colleague, well, I'm Emeritus now, but a colleague, Asaf Qureshi, in the law school, who teaches both Islamic law and American constitutional law, would argue that there is a checks and balances system in the old systems that is now not very much observed by rulers. In some ways, Saddam Hussein, who was, well, I won't say that aloud, but was not a very religious person, but who, of course, had to cloak himself, and who was a minority Sunni in Iraq, which is majority Shiite, but he has to cloak himself in Islam, just as some of our presidential candidates, and this is at a much lower level, but in order to say, to be your president, if you think a religious person should be president, well, let me tell you how religious I am. There are also changes in the way that Islamic law has been interpreted. Initially, the laws of war, the laws of calling jihad, for example, were supposed to belong to the caliph alone. So there was a check. It just, in a certain way, and I will say this here, though it may get me in trouble, in a certain way reminiscent of a certain German reformer who said that, talked about the priesthood of all believers and democratized Bible reading, that everyone could understand the Bible on their own. Eventually, interpretation began to diffuse that anyone, at least ISIS will claim this, and I'm sure that there is a legal justification somewhere in the corpus of Islamic law for this, that individuals can declare jihad. Well, now, if anybody can do it, you know. But the idea originally was that the caliph would contain all of that and would be judicious.
You're good. Mentioning Luther, we know that.
Well, I'm trying to be accepted and get my own authority. I'll take it from anyone. Okay, yeah.
Girls Park, New York, from 12th Street to 21st. Is that owned by the Jewish?
Well,
That real estate?
owned, I'm not sure, at least in the sense of, do all the titles belong, you know, to the properties? If we played Monopoly in Borough Park, would Jews own, you know, everything? I don't know. The claim of an eruv is a temporary. It's during Shabbat, so it's one day a week. But it is a religious claim that, again, depending on your force of numbers, can be made effective. And then you start running into, is it legal under New York ordinances to be able to attach, you know, something to a pole that marks out this corner turn of an eruv? So it's not necessary, I don't think, for Jews to own every property, though they may. The point is that if they make a religious declaration, then that's a potential for conflict with people who do want to drive and have no moral conscience about driving on Saturday. But those kind of conflicts, again, are pretty limited, at least so far. Israel, let's not even go there. And any other? Well, thank you very much for this. It's been my honor and my pleasure to be able to inhabit a pulpit for an hour.
I give thanks to you, Heavenly Father, through Jesus Christ, your dear Son, that you have graciously protected me today. I ask you to forgive me all my sins, where I have done wrong, and graciously protect me tonight. Into your hands I commend myself, my body, my soul, and all that is mine. Let your holy angel lead me, so that the wicked foe may have no power over me. Amen. Almighty God, merciful Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, bless, preserve, and keep us this night forever. Amen. Thank you for being here. Next week, Reverend Cindy Crane from Lutheran Office of Public Policy in Wisconsin will be our speaker.